Okay, so we have a web service endpoint. We call these web services endpoints. So the URL, right, that it's mapped to some logic that is retrieving data, right? We refer to that as a web service endpoint, right? And so let's see if we can use this web service endpoint to refactor the profile page, right? The profile page right now uses find client by ID, but on the client side, it's not coming to the server to fetch any of that data. So let's refactor that. All right, so let's see. Okay, so this is on the server side, so let's put that on the right-hand side. Right. Now on the client side, we have find user by ID, which right now it's iterating over what? It's iterating over the local users array to look for that user ID from the local array. Correct? We don't want it to do that. Instead, we want it to go out to the server and do that. Okay? So let's change this. What we want to do is we don't want this. So let's refactor that. Okay? Instead, I want it to go out to the server and fetch this data. So to do that, we're going to introduce a brand new service called the HTTP service. Okay? The HTTP service, notice that it starts with a $, right? So it's provided by the underlying framework. Right, it's going to allow us to interact with any HTTP URL that lives on the network. Okay, in particular to our web services. Yes, but it could also be just as useful to connect to IMDb or Yelp or Google or anything that is out there. Right, it would allow you to connect to. Right? Well, not quite. Right, things that do allow you cross-domain scripting that will allow you to get over the course, over the browser security measures, right? Anything out there that it allows you to connect to publicly, it would allow you to connect to those services, right? But in particular, it's going to allow us to go back to our services, right? So what we want to do, we want to do this, right? We want to go out to /API/user, provide a user ID, which we have. We've got the user ID. Right, so we want to build a URL that looks just like that, right? It starts off like that, right? And this ID we have, it's this user ID, and we want to connect to that, see if it retrieves data, right? And it's very easy to use the HTTP service, right? It says, how do you want to connect using a GET, a POST, a PUT? How do you want to connect to? And we know from the server that it is a GET, right? The server is expecting a GET. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to generate a GET. Right, to this particular URL, right, and we're going to listen in for an incoming response from the server. Okay, so to do this, to listen for a response, right, we're going to be using promises. Right, unfortunately, it's not as simple as this. You would expect that it would be that simple. So okay, this fetches the data, and I now have the data. Right, once I have the data, well, I just return it, just like we did earlier, right? Unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. Let's see what really happens. Let's see what really happens. Okay. So let's try here, and let's go back to logging in. So we're here. Make this a little smaller. Log in, and let's look at our network traffic. What's going on behind the scenes, right? So if I log in as Alice, and I go Alice, and I log in, this is going to take me to my profile page, and let's see. Wait a minute. Did I refresh this? Let's go back here. Let's refresh. So Bob and Bob network. Okay, so let's let me go back so I can show you. I'm going to clear this. Right, I'm gonna log in as Bob. Okay, notice that the request did go out. See that? The request did go out. There it is, API/user/234. Right, we were able to generate that request programmatically, and the server responded with the actual object we were looking for. That is the object we were looking for, isn't it? Okay. Now, if we step through this, though, notice that it came back, and we did a return $.get, so the controller should have received that. Yes, the controller should have received it. But if we step through the code in the controller, right, and we go to users and we go down to the profile, here it is where we do that query, isn't it? Right here, right? Actually, let's add a console. Let's add a console to that. Where are you? Public views. Where are we? Assignment, undergrads, views, and let's look in the user. Let's look at the controller and the profile here. Right, there it is. Right, there's my find user by ID. Right, and that's going to be put in the model. Let's do a console log user. Let's see what we get here. Right, and I'm going to refresh this. I'm going to put a breakpoint right here to see what we get. Okay, so refresh. We've logged in as Bob, and apparently the network came back with the correct data. Let's see, where is it? Why is it broke? It's breaking somewhere. Where is it? Oh, there it is. Right, came back. The data is coming back as Bob. Right, that's exactly the data we want. Now in the source, right, the breakpoint comes back here. If we hover over it, it's not exactly the object we're expecting. Okay, it's not exactly the object we're expecting. Right, if there's some $ state, some status information. It's not the user object that we were expecting that is coming from the network. Right? The network says here that it went out and retrieved the data, right? For the network. It continued, and there's the network right here, 234. Right. So the data that is coming back from the server is correct, right? But somehow it's not getting to our controller. What's happening here is that this call out to the find user by ID, okay, which converts to, in this, HTTP GET, yes, used to be like this, yes, right? This was a synchronous call, right? This call here, you know, as we've learned to program, typically we expect programs to execute from top to bottom, from left to right. Right? And if we go into a function, what we expect is that function, there it is, that's the function, that execution here stops until this function continues, until this function comes back. Yes? Right? That's how we learn how to program, from top to bottom and left to right. Right? And this function is, you know, this execution here is waiting for this function to come back. Correct? And it'll come back eventually when it finds the element in the array, and it comes back. And finally, we have that user, and then we can continue. Correct? Now, when we use this instead, when we change it to this, here we have a network connection, meaning the data doesn't live here. I'm going to have to make a network connection to some other machine that is hosting the data, right? And the default behavior is that this is asynchronous. Okay, this is asynchronous, meaning the thread that is executing this, right, is not going to block and wait for this GET to come back from the server. Okay, it's not going to wait. Right, instead, right, it's going to use AJAX underneath, and it's going to generate an asynchronous call to handle this request, and it's just going to continue. It's just going to continue, and continue whatever it needs to do. Right, in particular, rendering this console log user, right. Which is not what we expected, right? At some point, the server is going to come back. Right? At some point, the server is going to come back with the actual data. All right. And so what we're seeing displaying, when we in the breakpoint, right? When we got to that breakpoint, the server had not yet come back with the data. The server had not yet come back, right? Whereas our single thread continued, right? It hit our breakpoint, but the server had not yet come back with the data, right? So what we need to do is to register a callback for the data to say, hey, when the server does come back, call me back and let me know when that data is here. So to do that, we can do the following. right? We can do the following on the controller. What we get is not the actual data that we're expecting. Instead, what we get is a promise, right? A promise is a mechanism that allows us to register callbacks and say, hey, here's a promise that at some point in the future, hopefully in a very near future, I will have that response for you. But I don't have it right now. Go do something else, okay? And then I'll interrupt you when I have that data when it comes back. Make sense? Right? So we're going to not do this, right? Instead, we can do it a couple ways. We can store the promise locally. Yes, we can store that promise locally. And this is going to be asynchronous. And what this promise is going to allow us to do is to register a function, right, for callback, right? And to register, the promise object has a function that allows us to put in a function that will eventually be called when the data comes back. So we can provide a function here that says, here's a response from the server that I am going to give you later on when it comes back. Make sense? So here we can do a console log response. Right? And if we try this again, if we do it again, and we put a breakpoint in this console, okay, there's a response that comes from the server. This is what comes back from the server, right? Some status information, some metadata, and the actual data that comes from the server. There it is: first name, last name, password, and username. Okay, this is finally the data that we were looking for that came back from the server, right? And here is where we can bind the model dot user. We can bind it to the response.data. Yes, right. So now if I refresh and take out this breakpoint, notice I logged in with Bob, and there it is, my username. But that username now is coming from the server. See that? Right. If I log in as Alice, which is 123, I believe. Oops. 123. I have Alice. Or if I have a Charlie, I think this is Charlie. There's Charlie. Or I think that's Januzzi. See that? Right? All that data is coming from the server now, not from the local array. Make sense? Okay. All right, I'm just going to clean this up a little bit. This looks awful. I'm going to clean this up, so I'm going to remove that part. Right? We don't really need to have this local promise variable. Right? Instead, what is typically done is that we use the following syntax. We collapse this into one single, like this. Okay, so here's my find user by ID. Right? That returns the promise object. Yes? That promise object has a then function on it that allows us to register a local function. Yes? For callback. Right? I think this is still a little bit too hard to read. So what I prefer doing is creating an actual function. Maybe call it, I don't know, render user or something, right? And paste that like that. Meaning, when the callback comes back, call the render user and render the user. Everybody okay? Everybody still good? And if I run this, it still works with Januzzi or Bob or Alice. All right, still works. Everybody okay? Yes? This is a little bit still too messy. All right, let's clean it up a little bit. Instead of having the controller knowing that this is a meta object, that it needs to go and fetch the data inside of that, all right? What we could do that is have the service do that, right? Unwrap the data on the service side instead of having it on the controller, right? The controller shouldn't have to know about this network things, right, that happen and all this status information. So what we could do inside of the service here, inside of the service, right? We could unwrap it here instead of doing the then here, instead of using the then here, right? And unwrapping it here in the render function. we could do the unwrapping here, handle the then here, right? Handle it over here, and then this function is the actual response that comes from the server, and then do the unwrapping here and return what we actually want, which is the response.data. Okay, so we are unwrapping the data from within the service as opposed to doing it on the controller, right? And then the controller just gets an actual user. An actual user. Make sense? Right, so with yes.
You need both return statements.
Yes, yep. Right, so this is a little cleaner on the controller side. It keeps all the network issues, right? All those network concerns, right, inside of the service, right? The service is the one responsible to know where to fetch the data, what to do with it. We could also, which is typically in larger applications, what usually also happens here is that there is an additional model layer, right, where you have the controller, we have a model layer, and then a service layer. Right, the service layer gets the data, the raw data from the server, right, and then we might want to massage the data that comes back from the server, right, into a data model that is useful for your local client-side application. We're not going to go that far. We're just going to, our model is too simple to do that. But you will find often that in between these two layers, between the controller layer and the service layer, there is a model layer, right? Oftentimes you use it so that from the server, where you're hosting the big M, the big model, right? You have a lot of dependencies, you have a lot of references, you have a very hierarchical data model, right? And that's usually it's normalized data model, right? Following foreign keys and primary keys and relationships in the data model, right? In the database. But on the client side, usually you're just rendering a small sliver, right? A small snippet of the data set, right? So on the view, typically you just want a very flat data model, right? Only for rendering purposes. Okay, so that mapping between these two worlds, between the big M on the server side and the little m on the client side, the data model, the model layer would allow you to do that mapping back and forth, right? One in the model layer on the client side is concerned with rendering issues, right? As opposed to on the server side, it wants to have a very hierarchical, very normalized data model, okay, which is completely unaware or it's completely irrelevant on how you're going to render this on the client side. Make sense? Right. All right. So I think we were able to. Okay. Yeah. So we implemented the find user by ID and we moved it over to the server. Let's do the other ones. Okay. All right. Let's do a couple more. Let's stop this.